Well, related to the issues in the Joburg CBD this week has been the issue of counterfeit goods and how so many of them appear to be being sold in that part of the country. Researchers have said that the amount of money flowing through the Joburg CBD shopping area is twice as much as that which flows through the Sandton City shopping centre on an annual basis. But selling counterfeit goods also has an impact on legitimate and legal goods. Simon Eppel is the director of the Research and Policy Unit of the South African Clothing and Textile Workers Union, SACTWU, joining us in our studios in Seapoint now. Simon, firstly, good evening to you. Firstly, do we know how much counterfeit clothing is actually being sold in South Africa? Has anyone got a figure we can point to and say that makes sense?
Stephen, it's a great question. It's a very, very difficult question because how on earth do you identify the value of something which essentially flies under the radar? The estimates are that probably around 40% of the clothing imported from China alone, I'll leave out other countries, from China alone, probably about 40% of the products that come from there enter the country illegally. Now counterfeit goods is only one portion of that market. You know, those are usually branded products of a particular sort. But far beyond the counterfeit goods, you get the other products which are, you know, smuggled into the country or some other kind of tax evasion takes place to allow them to enter. We're talking billions of rands. We're talking probably close to around 4 billion rands worth of tax revenue alone from Chinese imports, which is lost from this kind of activity, from imports that are illegal. And obviously then there's other revenue that's lost when these goods are distributed through informal traders, through informal trade networks, such as those in the Johannesburg CBD. So it really is a significant cost to the South African fiscus, and it's a significant threat to the economy in South Africa, to jobs in the country, but also to factories. And that's why we see factories closing down. That's why we see jobs being lost. If we can arrest the sale of these goods into the country, and we can arrest the entry of these goods into the country, we really, really create the space for South African industries to prosper, for jobs to be created. And so we're very pleased, in fact, that these raids have taken place. We want far more activity from the state. There's a very, very big problem. This is the tip of the iceberg. Much more needs to be done.
How does it actually get here? I mean, you mentioned China. I imagine Vietnam. There are other countries that will be where these clothes are actually produced. How does it get here without it being stopped? Is this a question for SARS and Customs?
Yeah, it is. Essentially, you know, these products will flow in through the borders in a variety of illicit ways, and that makes it the mandate of SARS. Obviously, then the distribution side, the selling of that in various city centers becomes the ambit or the responsibility of whatever municipality or enforcement structures are there. But at the ports of entry, you know, there's several ways. One of the big ways would be you bring in products and you misclassify them. You know, they're supposed to be clothing products with a duty of 45%, but you bring them in under a different category of tariffs, maybe which have a lower duty or no duty. But then maybe you also go and you bring in, you know, 10,000 or 100,000 units, and you classify it as only 10 units. The container is stacked full of goods, but you just pretend it's far fewer. And there are several other ones, including under-invoicing, bringing products into the country and saying, you know, even though it's a blanket, for example, that should cost 200 Rand if it was declared legally, you declare it at 10 Rand and you pay a much lower duty. So all of these kinds of tricks and others are used to get them into the country. They're usually, you know, they are masterminds behind these kind of syndicates who channel these goods into the country. They then channel them to distribution networks who give them to the illegal traders. The illegal traders, the traders on the corner store, on the side of the road, these are just the, you know, sort of unfortunate pawns in a much bigger game controlled by people getting very rich off this process and endangering the South African jobs and South African economy.
All right, Simon, you say all of that, and we're going to come to that in a moment. But first, there are two sides to this. On the one side, you've got the people who are producing these goods, but they're sold at a very cheap price. And what that means is that people who would not be able to afford to clothe themselves in this way are able to. If, for example, this flow of clothes into the country was stopped point blank, I mean, we would be looking at people who literally would not be able to clothe themselves in any kind of, well, you know, just generally, but also any kind of style whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen, that's absolutely part of the argument. I mean, with no disrespect to them, you know, this was sometimes phrased as the sort of Walmart's, you know, low everyday prices model overseas. You know, when they entered the country in South Africa, that was one of the debates that happened. You know, if you deny people the access to very cheap clothing, I'm not saying Walmart obviously sells illegal clothing, but on the principle of, you know, if you deny people the opportunity to buy very cheap clothing, don't you impoverish them? I mean, we think actually the reverse is true. If you allow people the short-term gratification of clothing themselves in, you know, branded gear, etc., they're not going to get jobs. You can't build an economy on that kind of consumption. It allows you or takes away the opportunity for production, and it's production that creates jobs. Now, people can clothe themselves as much as they like, but they won't have any money eventually to clothe themselves. So a strategic decision has to be taken, and that's, you know, it can't be products at any price. It must be products in a manner and a form and a shape that's coherent with the kind of objectives of the South African developmental policy that creates jobs and allows people to have the money to buy their products.
Simon, I mean, when the Chinese economy started growing really quickly, they started to take massive market share in the textile industry, and not just from us. And I'm talking about over the last 20 years. I think this is right. There's almost no underwear made in the United States, for example. That entire market has gone to China and Asia. If that's the case for a country with as strong and as big and as rich an economy as the United States, I mean, would our textile industry ever be able to recover? And I say that when the vast majority of goods coming in, clothes coming in from China, as you said, aren't actually counterfeit. They're perfectly legal. I mean, you would think that our textile industry simply will never recover in that scenario.
Yeah, look, I mean, certainly the pressure from foreign imports and particularly illegal imports is a strain that the local industry really can't deal with. But you know, if goods come in legally, the local industry has got a much better chance of finding its feet, of competing. There's several ways that you can see that. I mean, the one is when SARS, when the Revenue Service was acting, you know, in its top, well, not quite top form, but a much better form, prior to the sort of shenanigans that took place that, you know, is quite famous now, we actually saw employment growth in the clothing and textile industry. And that's because a really sort of sophisticated, smart industrial policy was created and implemented in the industry, which allowed local factories to begin to compete. And then you had the collapse of SARS, and in effect then the porousness, greater porousness at the borders. And all of a sudden you had the industry beginning to collapse again under the new flood of illegal products. So it really shows you that if you manage your borders properly, you can create the space for your local industry to thrive. And that's exactly what we want to do in the industry. That's exactly the intention of government. And actually, that's the intention behind these kind of raids. You know, SARS, government more generally, have recognized the failings of not policing the borders properly. They've recognized that much more needs to be done. And they've recognized that if they do the job that they're supposed to do, South African industry can begin to get back on its feet, develop that robustness, develop that kind of vigor and energy, creativity and competitiveness that it needs. Without that kind of a space, obviously no local industry is going to thrive or survive.
Simon Eppel, thank you very much indeed. Before I let you go, I presume the SACTWU T-shirt you're wearing was made in Cape Town somewhere?
It was indeed. It's a wonderful question. Thanks for asking it. Obviously, there's huge sort of political uproar often when political T-shirts are imported. This one is made in South Africa. It's made in Cape Town. Stephen, it would be wonderful as a very senior journalist, anytime you see a political T-shirt of any political party, go and look at the label and ask the comrades or other politicians where their T-shirts are made. But this one absolutely is made locally.
With pride, by the looks of it too. Simon Eppel, thank you very much indeed.
With pride, yeah.
He is the Director of the Research and Policy Unit of the South African Clothing and Textile Workers Union, SACTWU.